Since we don't have that much time, I'm going to start off with two fairly general questions and ask any of you to sort of respond to it. Two questions I have about using mobile apps in behavioral health and the opioid crisis is, how well can you translate in-person, face-to-face treatment to remote engagement, which may be using video conferencing or something like that, to an actual app, or maybe there's not even an individual on the other side. How well does that translate, and is there evidence to show that it translates well? Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll start us off. Thank you for the question. You know, I think it's a great question, and I think there's been a lot of attention paid to that question. I'm not sure if it's the exact question we should be asking, which is that I'm not sure we need to perfectly mimic what's done in a face-to-face therapeutic relationship with what's done with a therapeutic tool on a digital platform. There are things that people may be able to achieve that are different than what the technology can do, and there are things that technology can do that are things people cannot do at all. And like we were talking about in the theme of this meeting, in terms of, you know, just unprecedented levels of data capture and insights into in pattern extraction and such, and looking at people's clinical trajectories. So I think they can be very complementary. There are elements of behavior therapies that we've seen in probably 2 decades now of NIH-funded research that has shown that some, you know, active ingredients of therapeutic models that have worked in clinician-delivered care can effectively be delivered via interactive digital technologies. But I think that there are lots of opportunities to not put artificial constraints on the technology to just mimic that perfectly, but to exceed beyond that and to have tools that literally can be with you in your pocket at the time you're trying to apply skills that you've learned in these therapeutic models, for example, that can help you execute those changes. And I love your question about the opioid crisis, because, you know, this is being called a modern plague. I mean, it's killed more people than car crashes and gun violence, and so the population level need is huge, and I think it's a striking example of an opportunity to leverage technology, because we don't have a sufficient trained workforce that can deliver the most effective resources at scale to enhance some of the effective medications that you're talking about. So thinking about how technology can help in workforce development and in direct-to-consumer resource delivery, I think it's a tremendous moment of opportunity for that. Thank you.
I would just say, from a regulatory perspective, since that's my bag, you know, it's interesting. FDA doesn't regulate practice of medicine, right? So as these tools are developed, it's interesting to see kind of the research come out and show how they are either advancing beyond what can be done in a traditional clinical environment, or some of them are actually not having that effect, right, and seeing what that looks like, and then not relying on poor data to allow, or lack of data to allow these products on the market in the first place.
Since you brought up the FDA, which is obviously your expertise, in terms of the pilot for precertification, a couple of questions related to that. One is, how long is the pilot anticipated to go, and what is the pathway to making a permanent FDA process? And then as part of that, and this is a more general question that I have around privacy, how much is the FDA considering privacy and looking at pre-certification or look at these apps? And I'll open the question about privacy to the rest of you. How much of a concern should privacy be in these apps, particularly when there's some concern about access to iPhone data or mobile phone data that law enforcement can enforce?
Well, on the kind of the logistics of the pilot, it's actually ongoing. It has 9 participants, and Pear is one of them. Apple is another. There's some other kind of big name companies, and maybe some that folks are not as familiar with participating. Have been doing so this year, this calendar year largely, and it's going to continue into next year. The idea is that they'll kind of play with this idea under the current legal framework before proposing something either legislatively or through regulation. That's kind of a black box, right? And that was, I mentioned, a couple senators had written into the FDA asking, what are your plans? That's kind of a key component that we're waiting to hear about. On privacy, I'll certainly defer to folks who have more experience with this, but I think that it's, it's a legitimate question that kind of permeates everything that FDA does, whether it's in an investigation or through marketed products.
Any other comments on privacy?
It's such a good, these are such good questions, and I don't know if Sandy's Pentland is still here, but he had some really great comments on that at the keynote at lunch. He was talking about how trust is so essential, and if you get trust, then you can get engagement, but how do you get trust? And there are really, documented, but also, evolving sort of understandings of transparency and accountability and how you communicate consent and what the tool is doing and what it's not. And I think sometimes when we talk about privacy, it's with a focus on protection, but there's a lot of opportunity for letting data flow when patients want it to flow, and it's in the best interest of patients to flow. So really understanding from that perspective, I think, should be informing a balanced discussion about that privacy.
I want to pick up on that thread because we have done some qualitative interviews with transitional age youth, and privacy is something that we always think of as really a big concern, and I think it is, but when we ask them about that, it's sort of a shrug, and they're less concerned, and I think it's, this generation where they're so used to data flowing and having that information out there, and that's sort of part of their life, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't be concerned about it, but it's definitely a shift in thinking around that.
David, did you want to add something?
Yeah, actually, I've been surprised. We've been doing ambulatory assessment since around 2005 with heroin and cocaine users in Baltimore. And we added GPS to that around 2009. And I worried about, first, how the IRB would respond, but mostly how the participants would respond. But I framed it in our protocols and consent forms as, look, as clinicians, we've made a lot of assumptions about your life over the years. This is your chance to make your voice heard, and we're doing this to listen to you. That was how I first introduced the idea of EMA, it was Palm Pilots that we were using to sort of prompt people several times a day about their moods and behaviors. And when we added GPS, we said specifically in the consent form, we're not doing this to keep an eye on you. At that time, we were using it to study sort of general principles about the relationship between the kinds of places people go and how they feel. And participants seem to respond very well to that. We're covered by a certificate of confidentiality, which gives us and the participants some legal protection against subpoena. Nonetheless, I'm not sanguine about it. A paper just came out by a researcher named Abby Rudolph. She did some focus group and interview data with 3 different cohorts, including a cohort of people who would have qualified for our studies in Baltimore and also some rural drug users, I think. And she explained in great detail how digital phenotyping and GPS tracking and all that sort of thing would work, and asked them how they felt about it and how they would respond. And too many of them said, well, for example, I'd be fine with being tracked where I go, but if I went to a friend's house, I wouldn't take the device with me because I don't want to bring my friend into this. A lot of people said they would subvert the tracking in some way, more than I thought. I hope that doesn't actually happen in people who meet us and sign consent forms and come into our studies and realize that we're not evil, but I don't know. And that's one reason that I think that we haven't moved quickly toward digital phenotyping is I'm not necessarily that relaxed about sitting down with someone and saying, oh, also, can you give us access to every text message you send and everything you do on Facebook? I mean, I think there's a great deal of potential and it's a fascinating thing to do, but I am concerned about how well people would accept it and what people might quietly do to subvert it.
Thanks. So we're really down to our last question. So I'm going to ask a question that maybe each of the panelists can answer, and hopefully there's a response for it. Dawn, you did a great job at the beginning talking about the various categories of risk and trying to de-risk these programs. And I'll ask each of you, because I suspect each of you will have a different perspective on this. What is the biggest risk? What's the one that's most challenging to move out of the way so that some of these programs can move forward and actually, not only affect the patients that you're working with now, but get to scale?
I would say from our perspective in this early stage, our biggest risk is the funding. We're fortunate to have resources from the challenge that we won, but we are always mindful that will be ending, and we will need to find ways to continue, because we not only want to develop a product, we want to get the research behind it to see if it's effective, and all of that requires the funding. So in this very early stage for us, that's a key concern.
Dawn's very clever. Dawn's very clever. She's sitting next to a funder when she makes that comment.
Now that our group is finally moving into a study where we are delivering content to people instead of just assessing them as we've been doing for so many years, my biggest concern is that you get someone at a crisis moment at 3 a.m. when they're all alone, and your app may do the wrong thing. And all I could come up with to mitigate that was to say that in this upcoming study, we're not going to enroll anyone who has any unresolved symptoms of PTSD, because I didn't want to be messing with that. I didn't want to give them a mindfulness exercise that says, well, I want you to experience all your negative thoughts and feelings right now, if those might be too much. I think having your app do the wrong thing when there's no one there to deal with that is the biggest risk I can think of.
So I'm going to mention a challenge that has been a very significant and long-standing challenge, but I'm hopeful is changing, which is that there's been a big challenge getting into the hands of people the tools that work the best, right? So there's this whole scientific community that are getting research grants and developing tools that can have big impacts, replicable, robust impacts on all areas of health behavior, and then they publish about it, they talk to their peers about it, the grant ends, and there's no life beyond that. And so I think these opportunities for partnerships, academic industry partnerships, and thinking about ways to bring the science forward that can scale up to population access, and this process in terms of the FDA review and authorization is essential to that, because this is a way to take the most evidence-based therapeutic tools and help bridge that gap. And I know there's complexities that are being sorted out with this pre-certification process, but given how rapidly technology evolves and and sort of the technology of the moment changes constantly, I think it's really important for us to have processes that can accommodate that and still push out tools that have active ingredients that really make an impact on health behavior.
For me, the biggest risk is this notion that regulation and oversight is inherently bad. Because, like David said, it's bad for a patient to go to an app, expect it to do something, and then have it fail. It's bad, I think, if we no longer have to rely on clinical trials or other high-fidelity data to prove that products do what they say they're going to do. That's ultimately bad for patients, and I think that regulation is one tool to assure patient protection, and it shouldn't be vilified. We should look for other ways, of course, to make sure that patients are being protected, but that's one of them.
Great, thank you. And by the way, the movement to pre-certification is really very much like the CE mark, which has been around for a while. It's about organizational quality as opposed to, looking at the device itself. So I want to thank our panelists. Thank you very much for your presentations. Very helpful and informative. And with that, Justin, do you want to give some logistics?
Very exciting panel. Let's take about a 10-minute break. We're just a little bit behind, but let's get the next and final panel started at 3:50, please. So see you in a few minutes.